Welcome to the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. I'm John Weddleton.
Jake Crane.
Dean Jits.
Ryan Yelp, Planning Department.
Christopher Constant.
Amy Stormer.
Chris Schutte, Office of Economic Community Development.
Mandy Honest, Clerk's Office.
That's right. Bill Walker.
Jane Walker.
Mark Bushcroft. James Thornton.
Ellie Winston, JDW Council.
Eli Bowman.
Raquel.
Brian Rose.
Very good, thank you. And Dave Whitfield.
Yeah, Dave Whitfield Planning.
Okay, so first on deck is the Blackberry Nursery. So if you want to sit up front here, you can sit at the table. Oh, well, it's all right, might need it. So it's Eli and Raquel.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay, so generally have you been to one of our meetings before?
We have not.
Generally what we'll go through it, and staff will speak on it, and then amongst the assembly members, we can ask the questions and talk amongst ourselves. And if you have something you want to add, just wait, and then I'll point you. So you'll get a chance to address everything, but instead of getting a talking conversation, you can go through it a little more methodically. So, but if you have anything to add, just go like that. If you can. And at the committee level, we discuss it. We may recommend approval or not, or maybe some conditions and so on. And when we go to the assembly meeting, then I think you're on the agenda for Tuesday.
These are on for Tuesday, the last item on the 13th.
Okay, so we'll state when it comes up what the committee recommends, but it's really a decision of the assembly meeting at that point. Okay, so Kathy, do you want to go through this?
So, marijuana licensure is Blackberry Enterprises LLC, DBA Blackberry Nursery, cultivation license restrictions, such as restricted access areas, separation of licensed premises, and security standards have been addressed in the operating plan. No access fees or fines were found due by licensees or affiliates. There were no comments received by the health department regarding the health and safety requirements of the license, and no extra conditions on the license are recommended.
All right, thank you. Any questions? Okay. Thanks. That was quick and easy, wasn't it? You know, easier, John. It's harder to drive here. She didn't tell you though, you're supposed to be filming.
Next time.
I'm sorry,
Did
Ron.
she tell you have to attend assembly meetings today?
No, she did not.
Okay.
Those can go pretty late.
Yeah.
Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Blackberry Enterprises LLC, DBA Blackberry Nursery, is applying for a special land use permit for marijuana cultivation facility to total approximately 4,644 square feet. Space within an existing light industrial use building. The proposed facility is within an I-1 district, generally located northeast of the intersection of Pine Street and Nielsen Way, in the Talking Campbell Community Council. Planned business hours are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday. The closest protected lane that staff is aware of is an athletic field approximately 1,550 feet from the petition site, measured via straight line distance. This cultivation facility intends to operate in partnership with a separate marijuana retail sales establishment located on site, separate unit on-site, and that'll be Alaska Weeds, and that'll be heard by the assembly on February 27th. So, committee meeting 2 weeks from now, we'll be addressing their case. Petitioner has provided all the necessary application submittal materials. The planning department has found these materials to be in compliance with the applicable provisions of Title 21 and 24 land use plan. And planning department recommends approval of the special land use permit subject to the conditions as stated in the staff report.
Great, thank you. And for the tape recorder, Pete Peterson and Amy Nabosky have joined us. Any questions?
Well, the only question I had was, there was a discrepancy noted between the state and the local application. Could you just give us a brief on that?
The only discrepancies in the state application, the floor plan showed basically an open area for cultivation, but on the floor plan submitted to the municipal application, it showed separated rows, so partition walls involved. That was the only discrepancy.
Okay, a couple things. One, January 3rd and 17, staff sent 144 notices to people within 500 feet of the business. And then on September 13th, the petitioner sent notices, presumably stated addresses within 500 feet. You sent 144 notices, they only did 94. And how would you, who makes these lists? Why would theirs be 20 less?
Should be the same.
Yeah, the
Same
list,
amount.
list should be the same. We'd have to go back, Mr. Royalton, and look at what happened there. But certainly it should be the same.
You think, and then I think they noticed 26 were returned undeliverable.
Yeah, we're required to send notices both to property owners and residents, and sometimes they come back undeliverable.
Okay, when, well, I understand that. I was just surprised. So yours was significantly less than theirs, and no one commented anyway, but, as we're looking at shrinking our packages here, so we don't include the security stuff, we don't have the state section, and this 139 pages, I think, was also in the page 16. Is this the state, or is this our application?
That's state.
So it was on the state application where they mentioned their 94. Billings in 94. So I'm just trying to make sure that when we shrink what we get, this is a little separate from your bigger thing. When we shrink what we get everything we need. So it's just kind of noticing that discrepancy.
Yeah.
And then find out why it would be different.
Yeah.
Are you giving them the same thing?
We should be sending them the same mail list, yeah, so the numbers should be the same.
Question is, do you mail to all individuals or just to households?
Typically just to households, really.
What's in business area?
So
Right,
we-
but-
So, yeah, we have to mail out to property owners, and then if they're, let's just say that there's a resident of a particular household that is different from the owner, we would mail both to the owner and to the resident.
And I don't think it's all residential or all industrial around there. I think there are some residential that close by.
Not much.
Not much.
So then another thing, it's resolved in conditions, but it does say, staff says resolved in True Gas Electric, that was just allowing. Then on page 26, you say, see, we have enough electricity, see the letter from True Gas Electric, so you flip to the letter from True Gas Electric, and they say, no, you don't.
We did not, we have to do a service somehow to get you guys electric.
Then on, Ryan, you said that the closest protected land use was 1,550 feet. Is that measured in the zone? Or what is that? It was an athletic field.
That was, I'll call it Papagayo Park. It's a soccer field.
So that was your measure on page 22 of 139, and there, submittal, it lists 3 protected uses, but none was an athletic field, and they were all much further than that. So they missed something there? How would that happen?
It's likely, I mean, when we screen for protected land uses, we check a variety of different sources. Sometimes, and we've seen it before in applications where applicants miss protected land uses, or they miss the required measurement to those protected land uses.
So you don't rely on their package so much, you start from scratch?
Correct,
Look at the
yeah.
location, you're measuring.
Correct.
So how did you miss it? Are you familiar with the athletic field at this park?
Honestly, no, but I contacted a real estate agent and asked for a protected land use map, and I know
Okay.
I thought it map was complete. I don't know where that part is.
Go on top of my head, yeah.
Just want to find out where the weak link is, because I'm sure you tried to do it properly, and somehow missed it. Protected land use map that we post.
Correct.
So if they looked at that, so we need to look at that map and see.
And it's the same map I use, so I mean, there's no hidden information on there.
Okay.
But generally parks are accepted, right? It's just ball fields, right?
And I guess there's a soccer field on.
Yeah.
So maybe you saw a park that's not protected, but there's a ball field on there. But protected use map that's highlighted. You said, when you're talking, how big is the floor plan? How many square feet?
4,644.
Oh, you did. Sorry, I thought you said 6,000. Okay. Why didn't I have anything else?
Bill, any comments since you got selected on this?
No, they've been in touch with us. I think plans have changed a little bit, but we'll be able to accommodate them once we get to it.
Thank you, Bill.
Ask all the questions on this.
Any other comments, any recommendations?
I'll recommend approval.
Any opposition? One opposed? You think a vote would be?
It would be easier, I wouldn't have to oppose it if you just moved it forward for consideration for full assembly, rather than recommend approval. That's just, I was told last time I'm not allowed to abstain, so.
Whatever, maybe you can.
Well-
General meeting.
I think she was advised with council not to abstain.
Oh, no, it's Francis, it was Francis.
Well, we had a motion and a second, so we vote. So I vote yes.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1 abstain, or 1.
I would, yeah, I'd rather abstain, but I'm perfectly fine saying no.
But you can speak to it. Does it feel okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so at the meeting, we'll say that we recommended approval, and Ms. Navasi will state her reasons for not. And we'll see where she goes.
Is there anything we need to address about people or not, or?
No, I've made it very clear on the assembly record, considering, the
Coal memo.
Attorney General rescinding the coal memo. In my view, it's clear that the state of Alaska and the municipality of Anchorage is in violation of federal law. And I think Congress needs to take action to correct those inconsistencies. And until such time, you know, it's just like, federal government controls immigration, the federal government controls regulated substances. So basically, our congressional delegation needs to get their act in order. But until such time that Congress doesn't take action, to me, this is a clear violation of federal law. So I won't be voting for any more marijuana licenses until it's fixed.
Dean?
Mr. Dembrowski asked the municipal attorney's office to give an opinion on that question, on that issue. I've been looking for the municipal attorney's office, we would finish for just a minute.
Thank you, Chad.
Thank you.
Question. Have you been to the Taco Community Council on this issue? Have you met with them?
Yeah,
When was that?
November.
Okay. And also on the retail store, you can report with the men on that too.
At the same meeting, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You'll remember meeting us there.
Oh, I do. I just want to get on the record. Sorry.
See you tonight.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thanks.
See you Tuesday. Who would do the dream? Is that, Ron, who's gonna talk about that? That would be you. Okay, let's not do that yet.
I like it.
It's cultivation on top. Okay, so we have, 2017 175 and 175S in front of us. We covered much of it, but there were 5 options on what kind of extraction you may or may not allow in B3. And it got too complicated for a Tuesday meeting. So we have, Dean has summarized very nicely the various amendments where they put us in this. You see it color coded. And I think if you work your way down, you get more restrictions on what we allow. And then there's a narrative on the second page that adds a little information. I did something in this that it was also emailed around. Was this printed and provided? Which does something similar. I break out a little more specifically what types of extraction are allowed under each of the amendments. And then I also included some comments that Dean and Brian, staff, planning staff had sent, commenting on what I prepared. And we also have each of these specific amendments. And I would not say that we are restrained to only these amendments because none of them are different. Seventh or something.
Good copy of this in email from Janet, relative to CO2.
Just last night, she sent it around 17.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I
See it last time?
So we have Valerie from Jen Weltzing's office to talk, and then Mr. Thornton is an extractor, I guess, and can talk to us a little bit about these things.
And Mark as well.
Okay, so if you can sit up. with the
Do you want me to pass it?
Sure, please do. And then this, do you have copies of these?
Yes, yeah, they're in the building.
Printed. I printed. They said it's just easy.
Check the email on that, right?
Oh, thank you.
So, I guess for starters, any comments from Assembly members? When you go through it?
I actually thought there were 6 amendments when I was looking. I only see 5 on this particular sheet here.
Well, we have amendments related to measuring in a straight line, and grading on that. It was not related to extraction, that was an amendment.
The 6 are right here. So there's a stack of amendments that are not in a table in that order, but they're actual 6 amendments.
But they're not all related to extraction. Right, so this is looking just at the one for extraction.
That's right.
And I thought we had settled on the one for measured in a straight line. Am I wrong on that? So we said, go ahead and go with measured in a straight line. That's my understanding.
Leave your own flag.
If I'm flying.
We're leaving birds alone now, we're going to ground.
Large goat or small? So I believe where we landed is just with the extraction. We need to figure out what we're gonna do here. Is there any comments from assembly members? Anything?
I would like to hear from the petitioners about their perspective.
Do we start with that or start with Dean could walk us through, and then maybe David, why you could embellish if there's some aspect, and then have the visitors go through it. Did you guys get this? Do you have copies for them?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see what we're working through. And anyone else, did everybody get copies of these? So who are you guys with? What's your?
We're just here to kind of observe how you guys are going with proceedings and stuff, as well, for perspective.
Okay, good. Well, that was smart of you to do that. Thank you.
Question, do we send this to Department of Health to get their impression as to CO2 or anything related to it? Have we heard from them?
I have not actually. Have you? Yes.
Because I would like anything we plan on doing, send Department of Health first, so we get their input on it, because we're not health experts.
Well, I think it might be wiser in that case to go to the building department, because this is kind of a function of engineers and those, the health departments. Gonna look at, not the OSHA kind of things, I don't think, so.
They might, Chris will tell you.
Yeah, through the chair, I'd recommend both.
Who would be like inspecting this?
Depends on which portion of this you're talking about.
You have extraction in B3, and does the DHHS goes in and looks at
So
these
as far as I
operations?
understand, and Ryan and Dave step in, DHHS does not, but they are involved in general air quality issues related to marijuana. I believe just the issue of can you smell it, basically, off-site. A lot of the technical building safety reviews and permitting is handled entirely by the building safety department. But given that one of the issues, I think, is the dispersion of CO2 external to the building, I don't think it hurts to have DHHS look at it, considering they're the air quality experts.
You have a food hygienicist involved with, at some levels, don't you? Who is that?
I know
don't know who
Is
the
that
person
someone on
is.
staff?
I don't,
It would be somebody from DHHS.
yeah, I don't know who the individual is though.
So like Moma's Bakery, they would go there and inspect that periodically? for
Correct.
Cooking?
Yeah.
But would they, then how about extraction facilities, once they're approved, they're allowed to?
I
don't
don't
think
know,
an
I
extraction-
don't think that they would be, doing inspection for extraction, no.
Because that seems to be a lot about, I went to tour one, and I didn't take my shoes off, and go in, and it was very
Yeah,
careful.
we might wanna ask you
That's what
just
this
a question.
testing labs do.
Where do they find themselves coming into this at?
That's what the testing labs are doing.
And they do it there too.
They don't do on-site checks, but they check the product for any kind of contamination that would come through that process.
Isn't that the big question right now?
It
Testing
is.
labs?
Yeah, it definitely is.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Okay, so we will do that. So, moving on before that, Dean, would you like to go through this?
Sure, I guess I'll be brief. I think the table is sort of self-explanatory. Basically, all the amendments we're talking about for improving actually the radar here, kind of hierarchy, like you pointed out, mostly roll around all types of manufacturing to the status quo, just edibles. And I guess that would make one comment at the beginning, so state regulation, they have marijuana manufacturing licenses. They have one that's for producing marijuana concentrate, which is separate from other types of manufacturing. And it's marijuana concentrates we would sell out. So edibles and refers, an oil or butter extract that's already produced, and we mix it up and make it contains or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. Those are the edibles. This is only producing that extract from that plant material. So that's for kind of license from the state. So in the state, it says you can only produce marijuana extract by this limited number of processes. And so at the top of our table is BAC 6555. It's all the processes allowed by regulation, which we're not proposing. And the beginning of this conversation was flammable materials, butanes, hydrocarbons that can explode, or something that I guess the body didn't want in B3 district, because close proximity, I guess, of businesses and so forth. It's not industrial type of use. I mean, it is an industrial type of use. We didn't see in B3 district. So, so this table from the bottom articles only, it didn't seem to make sense. You're not allowed to accept food-based, water-based production. It's not really dangerous at all, from my understanding. It's moving up from the bottom of this table. Our S version is the language that kind of put it in to get the S version down, although we have to propose this as we move up this table. So the S version basically refers to the state regulation and using terms that are in state regulation, water-based, food-based, or other methods, not employed solvents or gases. And then citing regulation subsections. So the planning department wanted to simplify that a little bit. If the state changes its regulation processes or something, and I guess, reading it, it could be cleaned up a little bit. I don't know of any plans in terms of regulation, but it could be done, I guess, at any time. But if they change the regulation, then the current S version referring to B1, 2D, it might be thrown out if they change the regulation and how the subsections are numbered. So planning wanted to exclude that part and also to replace extract for marijuana concentrate production using, instead saying producing extracts using. And I think it's just a little nuanced using one term or the other. I prefer the version if planning has to implement and enforce. So their preference should probably be given some weight, definitely. And then moving up, Amendment 1 in the middle, and Amendment 2, they took it to protect, laying this out instead of saying prohibited from using certain production methods. Instead of the other approach of saying you're allowed to use production methods. And I guess the advantage there is, well, I guess it's just a different approach. If we're being permissive and naming specific methods, the new methods are added later, we need to amend the code to allow those. And if we're prohibiting specific methods, new methods are added later that we haven't considered. Those could be allowed until we amend to restrict them. So, it just depends, I guess, on how the regulation might change as to what the effect will be, if that makes sense. And then, so Amendment 1 and 2 is prohibited and trying to specify, the methods in state regulation, which pretty much involve hydrocarbons, solvent-based methods, and the state regulation is, producing the hydrocarbons in butane, isobutane, propane, or heptane. And that seems like one category. Or other solvents or gases or foods that exhibit low to minimal potential human health-related toxicity. And we don't know what the board is going to improve at this point in the future. So that's an unknown and it's unknown. And then approved solvents must be at least 99% purity and must be used. Professional grade closed loop extraction system, environmental proper ventilation, and the control of all sources of ignition of flammable atmosphere is only 1%. And so if you look at Amendment 1 and 2 kind of just pulls out a few of those methods that are in regulation, while Amendment 1 just says all these are subsection. So 2 is prohibiting a little narrow, I guess, category. Then 1 just says anything in that regulation that I just read out is prohibited. And then up top, Amendment 6 is just specifically saying CO2 closed loop extraction system should be allowed because it's not an explosive substance, CO2 is inflammable. And I guess we had some debate last time. CO2 extraction systems is under very high pressure, as I understand it. I'm not a technical expert, but we got some literature and so forth, and we have space things here. Might tell you some more about that. But CO2 extraction system might be under 1,000 psi pressures or more, 2,000. And so it could, I guess, not explode flammably, but explode out of pressure. So that's, I guess, one of the concerns with the launch to be allowed about. And we had people comment that, if your building is got the walls against for this type of manufacturing, which has to be separated from everything else, according to regulation, and maybe that's okay. So I guess that's what the body needs to consider. Which one of these approaches is supposed to recommend. I hope that's the summary you're looking for, Mr. Chair.
That's good, thank you. Is that any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've actually had a lot of experience working with CO2 tanks, being in the restaurant business. I think I first sold soda using CO2 when I was 10 or 12 years old at a 4-H pop stand. And I've never heard of one of those tanks exploding. Well, yeah, there's pressure. They've been using this for, I don't know, probably the better part of a century. That's how, when you go to buy beer at a tavern and it's keg beer, that's how they get the beer out of the keg. The CO2 pressure.
No frame of reference, sorry about that.
You drink soda.
Yeah, but not the other stuff, sorry.
You drink, same process.
Yep.
Maybe, yes.
Yeah, I do have questions. I'm more familiar with nitrous oxide tanks and gases that are under pressure that are used in medical facilities. And my concern isn't the everyday use, but my concern is clearly what happens if you have a structure fire or something like that. Has anybody talked to the fire department?
I haven't.
Okay, so let me just talk with some of the experts. Go ahead.
I think we talked about discussing this with the fire department a while ago. Do you remember what?
I remember when we went through this initially, one of the first things I said for all extraction facilities is it's super important that you talk not just to the fire inspector, but have the stations do a walkthrough. So if they do what's called a QAP, which is a quick action plan. So if there's a fire, the station that's actually responding knows where all your explosive stuff is, basically, so you don't kill a fireman. I guess I'm a little biased because my husband is one, but so when it comes to that, that's a really important component, but I'm just not sure by injecting, CO2, you know, I don't know how big the tanks are, I don't know what the propensity is, if there's, an event, especially putting it closer to other retail facilities or other businesses. That's really where the concern comes from, not the everyday user's failures, if there is one. So if somebody's an expert and can talk to me about that, I'd love to hear.
Dean?
Yes, part of the state's application process requires the security plan, floor plan, show where certain solvents and materials will be stored. So that's all regulation. These chemicals that we're using is part of this close to the application process. So that was one of your concerns you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, that definitely is, but from a municipal standpoint, I think, I'm sure part of the checkoff facility is the fire department has to do a walkthrough. But every applicant that comes through when it comes to extraction type facilities, I really encourage them not just to talk to the fire inspector, because the inspector doesn't respond when there's fire, but to actually go to the local fire station that's going to respond and have them do a QAP, which they should be doing anyway. But to me, it's just one of those proactive measures, but I still need to understand, injecting these types of, gases into, or, you know, tanks into a business district. How big are they? How do they respond if you have an event? I mean, I'm starting to read this letter that was, I didn't see it yesterday. And my understanding is that if it leaks or whatever, it's just gonna leak and there's gonna be a sensor that's going to notify them. But what happens if there's a fire? Like, how does it react?
The same way that the one under the soda cake does.
I don't know that answer.
They're using basically the same cylinders. Some guys use, in a bigger operation, they'll use a little bit bigger CO2 cylinder, under like 75 pounds. But most of them are using the same cylinder that the soda and beer guys are using. So if you have one of those stuck in your restaurant, it's gonna be the same response for your fire.
So we're talking smaller roads, because I'm used to using, tanks that are as big as I am. And so when I'm looking at a medical facility, that's what and I have major, EPA and state and local guidelines.
Yes, you have quite a number of different gases in your tank. And yours are all regulated by a different set of rules, but, the tanks in question here are either just straight up 75-pound CO2 tanks that anybody can get from Maryland Queen, the same ones that the welder guys are using, except that it's for different gases in it. So in a fire situation, you have a pressurized tank that's gonna take it's gonna take a lot to get it to do anything. What would it do at that point? Probably spring leak. I mean, they're all DOT shipping containers, they come in, they're all gonna burst thing out anyway. So, I'd be a lot more concerned about responding to a restaurant fire than I would, a fuel operation fire that's full of plants that are basically generated.
Right.
There's an example.
No, that's exactly, when you said 75-pound tank, you answered my question, because that's what I'm trying to conceptualize in my mind. I'm very visual. This really helps.
So, yeah, I mean, the guys that are buying extractors, the extractor guys don't sell the tanks.
Right.
The doors buy their own tanks, so they're gonna buy whatever they're gonna buy.
Yeah.
But they're gonna go down to Air Liquid or wherever you get these things and buy them. They're not gonna come in this big monster thing, because they gotta handle it.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you have to refill it, and you have to, absolutely.
Just a quick point of order, Francis appears to have brought in someone from the fire department, so, we have an expert that might be able to meet some of these concerns.
Do you want to take a seat up here?
Let me throw that back.
I can just stand. So what are
I
your
actually heard you use
questions?
CO2
So-
We
to
should
fire
say
now.
who you are for
Oh,
we're
sorry,
recording.
Cleo Hill Fire Marshal.
And we're talking about marijuana operation extraction from the plant is allowed, but we're looking at, should we allow it at some level within commercial districts B3? And trying to weigh where we draw that line.
Okay.
And are you familiar with the different extraction techniques?
I am.
Stuff they use? Okay, so do you have any thoughts on, is there an issue putting in commercial districts? If there is, what should be allowed?
Can I quickly add to that we are not contemplating at this time having any flammables, just the question really is around carbon dioxide.
Okay.
CO2 tanks and CO2 extraction methods, and that's what I was asking, was specifically, has anybody talked to the fire department and about any concerns? And here you are.
Here we are. So when we review these facilities, they all have to go through a change of use. And for the facilities that have carbon dioxide, that also goes through plan review. And there are a few things that we check. We check the size of the tank, where they're gonna locate them. Our concern is not a fire concern with carbon dioxide. It is, carbon dioxide displaces oxygen. So if there were to be a leak, the alarm goes off and notifies everyone there's a leak so they can evacuate. But that carbon dioxide does not fuel a fire. Now, there is always the possibility of, I heard this gentleman explain, if the tanks get hot, they could explode. That very seldom happens, but it is a pressurized tank, so that is something to consider. But you have more of a danger with a barbecue grill propane tank than you would with carbon dioxide.
Homeless camps that have propane tanks, they would run.
Thousands of them, yes.
Sorry.
So, whether you put it in a business district or an I district, from a fire standpoint, there's no hazard. There's no greater hazard, let me rephrase that, there's no greater hazard than there would be anyplace else.
We're also looking at potentially some, possibly toxic chemicals used for extraction.
So the ones that I'm familiar with now, they have very minute amounts of toxic chemicals. Those chemicals, and their plan on how to handle those chemicals are also part of the plan review process. So we will ask what types of chemicals, what the amounts are. We're gonna look at all their hazardous material protocols. The engineers that are involved also look at their safety plan. And then when we go do the inspection, we check what chemicals they have, how they store them. And then once more, we look at that when we go do the actual marijuana inspection. So what we have seen so far is minute amount that don't pose any problem. Everyone to this date has been under the exempt amounts by the fire code, so that too has not been an issue.
So Ms. Dabowski mentioned that separate from your work, the local fire department should come and do a QAP, to come and look, and is that routine for them anyway, is it required?
That's a trick question. They sometimes do QAPs, qualified action plans. We have not been doing them on a regular basis for about the last year and a half due to the amount of medic runs that we've been going on. But it is our standard procedure to become familiar with all the businesses in our areas and the floor plans of those businesses and what chemicals and such they have and what processes they have.
Okay.
No, that's good. I was just really questioning about the CO2 tanks and if that would be a concern to the fire department at all, because I didn't know how CO2 would respond.
So the operations so far that you've dealt with had such small amounts of toxic chemical in the tanks worth so much. But we're really new to this industry, so perhaps there'd be consolidation and we end up with a really large facility. I mean, we went to the one Babylon, and there's this 320 square feet and two 20-foot connexes all together, pretty amazing. So it's tiny, essentially. But we grow, and they have a 10,000 square foot warehouse full of these things, and so it'd be like
So
10 times that much.
we have this wonderful red book called the International Fire Code that our assembly adopts into ordinance. And in that wonderful book is all these rules and regulations and criteria for hazardous materials and the buildings that store or use those materials. So if we were to have an extremely large facility that would need thousands and thousands of pounds of carbon dioxide, the fire code would require automatically certain protections. Distances from other buildings, separate rooms to store the carbon dioxide, alarm systems, sprinkler systems, special construction around that room, explosion proof. And it would require the same thing for extreme amounts of hazardous and toxic chemicals. So the fire code's gonna take care of all of that.
Okay, that's good to know.
raise a question. If we authorize the use, and then the use starts at an exempt amount and then grows to an amount that is no longer exempt, do they get some kind of a grandfathered right, or do they become subject to the requirement based on just the natural order of their change?
They would continually be subject to the requirement. Once they hit above the exempt amount, it's a whole new ballgame. They would have to retrofit their building, et cetera, et cetera.
And so then the question is, how would that information come to you?
Inspection.
And is that done annually?
It is done annually.
You're inspecting these annually?
Renewals.
For renewal, okay. That's good to know. Yeah.
Just about every 3 or 4 years, we have to go through all the building
Right.
codes.
Yeah.
And come to us, and you'll enjoy this.
Believe me, I know.
We're having the experts that tell us it's this way,
Yeah.
go by the code. We have people come and say the code doesn't pertain in this case. We've been there before, haven't we?
I just want to know that by saying yes to this today, we don't authorize a licensee to just grow exponentially with the claim that we have a right to do this because we were authorized.
When's the fire code coming up again for renewal, do we know?
I've actually expected us to already be in the process, so I'm expecting Ross to bring it up in the end of this month, March, to start
That'd be
over.
what, the 2018 code or 16
The
code?
2018.
Well, they can't increase too much without having to come to us in the state to let us know about changes, so I don't see that happening, but I suppose it's possible in many years in the future.
If our trigger is square foot, things like that, would our trigger be you use more chemicals in extraction? Would it be the assembly?
Changing your manufacturing processes, you do have to go back to assembly.
But if you were doing, high pressure CO2 and all of a sudden you're doing 10 times as much and you got 5 more machines, would that trigger something? It's the same process.
As long as it's not an expansion in gross square footage, as long as it's not modifying the floor plan, they're just putting bigger tanks in a room that's already been shown in the floor plan. Technically, that wouldn't require some approval.
I think I might comment there, because I'm the guy that would have to do all the plans and build. You don't go put in a whole bunch of equipment in a building without modifying the building, because the space isn't there. If you're just gonna modify a building, that takes a building permit, and you go on a plan review guys, and you go through the whole engineering committee, and you go through that process all the time, and it's all, above board, and no contractor's gonna sneak in there and just do it for it, since they're all, they're gonna want a permit to do it, that's gonna take the whole permitting process.
Mr. Chair, could you get his name on there, sir?
Oh, sorry, your name?
Mark Frischmeyer.
Mandy?
One of the other things with the renewals is the application asks for any changes, and so they would denote on there if they had upsized their procedures by any means, so you would see that in their renewal applications too.
So a lot is covered here, so do we want to go to presentation, or Mark, are you doing it, or?
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having us today.
We could go till 9:30, but we want to have some time to discuss and figure out where we're gonna land, so.
Okay, great. To help aid.
It's 10:30.
10:30. So 10:30.
I was gonna say.
We said 9:30, so-
I'm sorry, 10:30.
Okay, so I say I have to go backwards here. All right.
Let's talk about Walmart's.
Sorry, go ahead.
So to help aid in your decision-making process regarding the potential use of a closed-loop CO2 extraction system in the B3 district, I searched for an engineer to help us all understand the potential risks involved with CO2 extraction and how the machine itself works. Mark Fritchhorn is the Vice President and Principal Engineer at RSA Engineering in Anchorage. In addition to designing cannabis extraction labs here in Alaska, he has over 2 decades of experience in his field. He's here today to present technical information about the CO2 botanical extractor for your consideration. Before I turn it over to Mark, I would like to clarify my intention in supporting this amendment. I am aware that one of the concerns related to this issue is drawing a line between commercial and industrial applications. We believe this is a strictly commercial application, as we will be using food processing equipment to produce product for sale in our co-located retail store under one roof. Mark's research has shed light on the fact that pressure vessels and CO2 systems are currently used in many applications, including most restaurants, ice skating rinks, and even in most of our own homes, if you're not using a wood-burning stove, that is. Finally, I would just like to say that the type of extraction equipment we are using deals only with pressure and carbon dioxide, a natural fire suppressant. Unlike butane or propane, it is not flammable or combustible. Thank you for your consideration, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Okay, Mark?
Okay, so I've been back around the engineering business for quite some time now, and so what I do is put mechanical equipment in buildings and make it all work. You can read the whole deal there, but first time I ran across the extraction business was Babylon Labs. I signed for one. And they came to me and they said, under this regulation, we need you to, approve our extraction machine. Okay, so, his happens to be a butane operation, and, once I looked at what was going on there, it's a fairly straightforward operation. So I've been looking at these things ever since, because once I did one, all the other suppliers in town said, oh, you're that guy, and I showed up in my office saying, hey, would you look at ours too? So I had to really start doing a lot of research and figure out, what am I getting into here? Because I don't know if I'm just be approving the or whatever. So these things are basically refrigeration equipment. They work exactly the same as the refrigerator in your house. They have, they're taking a refrigerant, in this case carbon dioxide, and they're rocking it between liquid and gaseous state. And in the process of doing that, they're using it to, usually that's used to move energy around. In their case, they're using it to get plant solids, plant oils out of plants. So the basic process is to stick your plants in a vessel, and your pictures there that you've got laying around, that's one that says extraction vessel on it. It's got the blue rings on top.
Just for the tape recorder assembly the Dyson that's joined us. Okay, so you got this thing labeled extraction vessel. That's where you put your plant material. And then what you do is you basically flood it with liquid CO2 or supercritical distinctions. When you're doing that, you want to do it at a temperature that apparently warmer temperatures extract better than colder ones, so you want to warm it up. So in order to get it at a warm temperature, you have to pressurize it in order to keep it in liquid state, just like any other gas. So they run it up to about 1800-ish PSI. And that's what the big green thing is on the side, that diaphragm compressor, that's its job. That's to take the CO2 out of the cylinder where it's sitting at about 800 to 1000 PSI when you buy it. They increase it up to about 1800 PSI just so they run at the temperature they want. Depending on who it is, they might want a higher temperature, lower temperature, higher pressure, lower pressure, whoever they are, depending, how does their process get the best, whatever they're trying to get out of the plant. And then it goes over to the separation vessel. So what you've done in the extraction vessel is you've dissolved all the plant oil into the liquid solvent. And now it's in the solvent, it's in a liquid. How do you get it out? Well, you go ahead and let the pressure off of your solvent. And when you let the pressure off, it goes to vapor and it leaves the oil behind. So you drop the oil at the bottom, catch the vaporized CO2 off the top, or butane or whatever you're using, it doesn't matter. And you then send it back over to your tanks and put it back in your tank so you can use it again on the next cycle. This whole process, what they tell me, takes like 8 to 10 hours to run a batch. So you're not cranking this thing through all the time, and you're basically reusing most of the gas that you put in the first place. You will lose a little bit when you pull the tanks open and get your plant out. So these things have been around actually for quite some time. They actually came out for going there about diesel oil and stuff, but seriously, they got used for perfume oils, essential oils for making perfumes out of, pulling oil out of hops for making beer out of, pulling glue out of wood to make wood glue out of. I mean, they've been around for years and years and years. Then when medical marijuana started showing up about 10 years ago, those guys started looking around and saying, well, how do we get the oil out of our plant? And they found this product, and all of a sudden everybody that's making this stuff said, cool, there's a big new market, and it's way bigger than anything we've been doing so far. So all of a sudden they've been popping up everywhere. But I'm sure there's some that are popping up because the marijuana market has, but for the most part, these guys have been building these things for years. It's all listed equipment. It's all built to the various codes that pressure vessels are built under. It's all just like any other commercial kitchen equipment. You bring it in, you put it in, you set it up, you operate it in the way that it's supposed to be operated. And it's it's equipment like any other that you got to know how to run. I got a
did hear about the stigma of extraction, and the fire departments in Colorado had a hard time with this when they first ran into it. They're like, well, isn't that the process that blows people up all the time? Yes. Because the first guys who were doing it under the black market operation weren't buying, listed equipment, don't just go buy this to do something, what do you do? So what they were doing is taking a tube, welded pipe or whatever they're making, and then just blasting propane or butane through it, because that's the refrigerant they can get. And then they're just venting that off the atmosphere, and as they vent it off, that's when the oil drops off. Well, venting off, butane in your garage next to your water heater pilot light. Duh. If you're smart, at least out in the backyard, and the neighbors aren't with you. So those are the kind of small time guys. Anybody doing this for a big commercial operation isn't going to be doing it that way. It's just too dangerous, and you just can't get the throughput of it. Plus, then you got to keep buying the refrigerant, which you could just be recycling if you make the additional investment of buying a piece of equipment like this one. So it's like any other. Those are all pressure vessels. Every pressure vessel made in this country anyway is built to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code. That's a standard code that's 16,000 pages long. It's written on how to make boilers, water heaters, pressure vessels, like what they call unfired pressure vessel, which these ones are, because there's no fire behind them. And once you've achieved all their standards, then you get your stamp that says, yep, you're supposed to go. Certain of these things are too small. ASME says, once the cylinder's too small, we really don't care about it. And what those smaller guys have been doing is they've been going and getting an ASME inspector anyway. And he's been inspecting it to the ASME standards, because these guys know perfectly well that, if one of these things blows up, they're screwed. So one of the things that every pressure vessel has is a relief vent. So if it overpressurizes, it basically pops open and dumps the pressure, dumps excess pressure. Your boiler at home has one of those, your water heater at home has one of those. You haven't heard about a boiler blowing up in anybody's house or business for about 100 years, because that's how long insurance companies got together and said, okay, we don't like that, figure something out, and that's where all that came from. So, you pop this thing, you vent a little CO2, well, that relief vent is going to be run out to the roof or somewhere, so it's going to go outside and dump into the atmosphere where we have naturally occurring CO2 anyway. So it really doesn't present all that much of a hazard. The cylinders that they use in the building, their tanks, those are all DOT approved shipping cylinders, because you got to go buy this stuff. Well, you're only going to buy it in a tank that is approved to be shipped somewhere, because nobody's going to ship it in a tank that you can't do that sort of thing. So what failure modes we really got to work with on this? Well, okay, so you got a bunch of tubes and fittings and flange gaskets and things. So at worst, you're going to pop a fitting or pop a fitting or a valve, or somebody's going to open the wrong valve at the wrong time, and it's going to vent into the room. That's the operator's problem. Okay, he's going to then have to get the CO2 out of the room in order to protect his operators. Is he going to bother any of the neighbors? No. A 75-pound cylinder of CO2, if you dump it to atmospheric pressure, is going to make 655 cubic feet of CO2. That's 9 feet by 9 feet by 9 feet. It's not very much. And as soon as you let it into the atmosphere, it's just gone. Okay. So by the time it gets near anybody else's property line, nobody's going to know.
So that's CO2. I mean, there are issues if you had, like butane.
Yes.
Because then
Butane operates exactly the same way. It runs at a little bit lower pressure, down around 200 psi or so. Their rooms have to be built a little different, because now they're going to be what's called a class 1 div 2 or class 1 div 1 room. And what that means is it has to be electrically safe, so that if they do get a small leak in the room or a big one, they don't have a spark available to do anything about it with. They're also going to have an exhaust system on theirs to vent the room to get that out of there. Bell Labs has all of that. And a lot of their stuff is pneumatically powered, so it's not electric in the first place, just because they're worried about that very thing.
So for this particular thing, we're not talking about allowing butane extract. I just want to be clear, right? We're talking about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, we're on our span here.
Yeah.
The one that's not proposed at the top, not proposed for B3 is
Okay, thanks. Don't go far.
Okay, maybe I'm reading this one. So, from what I've heard, to be honest, my concerns with the closed loop carbon dioxide extraction system have all been satisfied, so I'm not opposed to that. I think it sounds reasonable to me.
It's off-the-shelf equipment.
Yeah, I really don't see an issue there. Now, if we're talking about, and I don't think anybody is asking us to allow butane extraction methods in the B3, right?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so, see, I think we can cut this off really quick, because I think
That's a
if we have a consensus, my concerns have been answered, so I'm fine with that.
Well, we still have a span here, and going through maybe Dean and then Ryan.
Well, I think that there are, the real question that for me is, and I always get this backwards, the permissive versus the restrictive method. Do we list the uses that are allowed, or do we list the uses that are prohibited? And each of those questions comes up with some scenarios to contemplate. I mean, there could be some innovations that we don't necessarily want to see happening in a B3 district, that because they weren't specifically restricted would then be allowed, right, when the state changes. And so that argues for, I guess, the restrictive, or is it the permissive way? The one that, we have to specifically allow a use in order for it to be allowable. I think that's the direction we've gone and started, and I think it's wise that we continue that way.
No, I agree with you.
And so I don't know which one that would be relative to 1, 2, or 5.
Well, I think 5 and the F say facilities that do these things are okay.
Right, and so
Not with solvents or gases as described, permitted. So the S version's fine.
Or 1.
Okay, so I had it backwards, didn't I? So to allow closed loop gas extraction system as described, now is that, do we have to specify in there, that has to be a CO2 gas loop?
I think number 1 actually restricts the CO2 gas loop.
Okay, so originally on mine, I thought 6 was the one that allowed it.
6 can be attached to any of them, I think, except for 1, because it would be.
Good Lord, can we just make it, which one do we need in order to say we can have CO2 gas loop system in the B3?
Yeah,
It was,
that's 610.
Okay.
If I Mr. Constant asked Amendment 6 to be written so that it can be added to any one of these options. So specifically allow the CO2 closed loop extraction system as an add-on to any of the other amendments.
Except for number 1, because number 1, it would be absurd to write or closed loop gas extraction system. I guess you're right, no, it does work, because closed loop gas is butane or propane or anything, and then except carbon dioxide allows it.
Yes, that was kind of my perspective.
Gotcha.
I guess there's other types of gases that actually use the boost in the system. So just allow us to boost in the system.
That's what I'm going for right there.
Any, Ryan?
So in order to make it work, we have to do one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe for simplicity's sake, saying not employing solvents or flammable gases. I know we had talked about that before, but if we were to tack on carbon dioxide closed loop extraction system, which is double the length of the sentence, and we like short, concise.
It's terrible, to be honest with you, to have 2 amendments to make one. I mean, I think there should be a clear way that we could say, you're not using these flammable gases, which are already not allowed.
Right.
But you can use this. Somehow there's gotta be.
Well, we can make another amendment.
Yeah.
I think that's what we would do going forward.
Third amendment?
No, amendment 7.
Welcome to sausage being made.
They're here to go to the assembly for, Amy.
Because I'm the one that says, I don't get it. You have to dumb it down for me sometimes.
There's a couple points
You
here.
have a question.
It didn't quite come out, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was, the S version, the way it's phrased, would allow some solvents that aren't safe to eat. Whereas Amendment 5 from the planning staff is worded, when they say food-based, your working definition of that is you can eat it. Whereas the S version would be stuff that won't kill you. Or it's like, is that right? I mean, there is a difference there. They're
Right,
not
so-
simply rewording
Yeah, so the discrepancy between food grade and food based, and it just, goes back to food grade is something you could eat, food based is just comprised of food grade and food not. So,
You're looking at me because I hate it when it's not like just said clearly.
Well, it's clear to them, because they know.
As long as you know.
Their working knowledge of food base is something you can eat, so that's why you have water, butter, whatever, those kinds of things. But there's chemicals that would be allowed that create product that is okay to eat, which you wouldn't allow to be used for extraction, because the product itself can use that.
well, it was the manner in which the product's being used. I mean, there are several hazardous chemicals that can be used in a very non-hazardous way, but as soon as you use it in a hazardous manner, it becomes frankly, a hazard. So if somebody's using, a food-based item in a non-harmful way, that is something that we don't see an issue with. But if they're using it as a solvent, that puts it in this gray area, because is it now solvent-based extraction, or is it still food-based extraction? So, making the call and just saying if it's being used as a solvent, it's solvent-based extraction. But if it's being used in a manner that's defined as food-based extraction, then it's food-based extraction.
But we use ice water to sell a
That's a
solvent,
solvent,
right?
that's exactly
Water is a
right.
solvent, so you're still.
Correct. So yeah, water is the universal solvent, but in the way that it's defined in state regulation, this is water-based, this doesn't say water-based solvent. So it's how it's described and how it's interpreted going down the line.
So you're telling Amy there's no hope for clarity.
Pretty much.
No, actually, was in the packet here.
But what you said made sense to me. See, I don't know how that works.
So if you look in the packet, there was a proposed amendment that I haven't really contemplated too closely, but.
Where'd this come from, this came
Yeah.
from? Okay.
Yeah, and, it says solvent. Marijuana manufacturing facilities only extract the marijuana concentrate production by using water-based, food-based, or other solvent extraction methods not employing flammable or combustible solvents are permitted.
Here, which one is that? 'Cause I don't have it.
It's in this packet from
Jen, you turn.
Right here, last one.
it's in here.
So you're pretty close to the F version.
Oh, it's in that one.
Chris, could you make sure that's the right one? And, I believe it is.
But that might be too permissive, or just, I don't know what the term is, it might be too open.
I think what we're trying to limit is the use of combustible or flammable solvents.
In B3.
So,
That's also maybe conflict.
Right, that's the area that is gray.
Can we get, Dee, do you have this?
here we go. It's in that.
I could print one.
Page 4.
Sorry, give me a second.
Can I get Ryan's comment on this one? I understood what you said. Sorry, Danny. Have you looked at Jana's amendment?
I have not had sufficient time to review what was submitted. It was submitted after hours last night. But what I can say is I don't see anything that really is that substantially different from the proposed amendments already on the table in this one.
So it's short.
Of course, we've got amendment number 5. That's the one we're supporting. If there to be any revisions or additions, I think it'd be my preference that you tack on to amendment number 5 or amendment number 5 and further amend it to amendment number 7.
I had already had on my list that I thought amendment 5 was good.
So, Mr. Chair, then it would be 5, adding the language allowing carbon dioxide closed loop. Would that be acceptable or reasonable?
We could specify CO2 closed loop, and I guess it'd be a good question for Dean whether or not stating, in amendment number 5, or other methods not employing solvents or flammable gases. Because then that would prohibit solvent-based extraction as well as flammable gases such as butane.
Right. Adding the word flammable gases changes the whole amendment.
Yeah, and that would, it doesn't explicitly state CO2 closed-loop extraction, but it also would exclude.
So if we added on 5, we said flammable gases, then you don't need amendment 6 tacked on. Right?
Correct.
Okay. And why did you not have, but you didn't say flammable gases initially, what was your?
Correct. So a lot of the discussion this morning has been centered around safety, which of course is a very, very important topic. But when we were initially coming up with this language, we were looking at it purely from what is commercial, what is industrial, what are similar uses in land use code, and what do we have to compare this to. The only manufacturing definition in code that mentions the use of producing something via solvents or under high pressure is heavy manufacturing, and that's only allowed in heavy industrial districts. Yeah, too. So that's where we said, well, comparing this to what's already in code, what we can already sort of hang our hat on, closed loop CO2 extraction would fall under more of an industrial type of process. And that's why we decided to exclude the use of high pressure gases for extraction.
So, and I understand that, and I've given some thought to this, like why we separate industrial from retail and so on. And part of it is because you get industrial, you got big trucks coming up. It's not just the safety stuff, but it's the activity. You big trucks with noise and that kind of thing going on. But if it looks like retail, in a retail area, you're kind of good with it. If the ammo can has a bakery behind it, or you just see retail really. So the level we're dealing with now, especially when we go to Babylon, and you could fit their operation in my back room, and it's so small that I'd still look retail. Wherever you would put that is going to look, if they have a retail operation, your sense will be that it's retail, not manufacturing. So, the impact from using an area would not change.
Well, Mr. I guess I have a question for the industry then, because a lot of our concerns are, where is this going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the line, and what are the size of these facilities going to look like? So is there a reason that down the line, right now we got a max size of an extractor, 5 pounds, is there a reason you couldn't do 20 pounds, 50 pounds of product at a time? Or is it just that's where the...
I feel like the system that we're talking about using, the CO2 closed loop extraction system, is a high production unit, and it is a slow process, and it tends to be used 24 hours a day. It runs constantly to produce that product at a slow rate, and I don't foresee any reason we would need to add another unit. I think one would suffice, at least for our use, and I'm not planning on expanding. I have about 300 square foot area that we're planning on doing this in, and again, this is it's a really expensive machine, and there's really no reason why I would have another one. So if that became an issue, I wouldn't mind keeping it to one.
Well, and this is something I emailed you. You could maybe limit to square foot and say, okay, we can do this, but you can't go over. And I think I can do 320 square feet because that's what Babylon was. But say 350 or some amount, so that you wouldn't have, a little retail with a huge, facility. But as far as trucks coming and going, they're not doing it because the stuff they make is tiny, even if they did a lot. And you're not having. They have all the product that they're going to extract in this freezer, and it's a lot, especially because it's a long process. They have a backlog. So you're not getting trucks delivering, like a typical warehouse.
Yeah. When we look at this, we were, of course, everyone's concern is the safety. Certainly, I think the municipality of Anchorage has safeguards in place to deal with that. From a land use perspective, we were looking at the distinction between commercial and industrial. When Ryan was, and he's done an enormous amount of research on this, when he was looking at this, we compared this use to what some of the uses that were already permitted in the B3 district, such as commercial food production, and some of the things that we see there. So that's kind of how we derive the language that is our preference. Certainly this could be amended quite easily to include CO2 extraction methods, but that's kind of where we're at. We're looking at it from a more zoning, land use based viewpoint.
So if we amended yours and put flammable gases, simple, then it would allow closed loop part of that side. And you're afraid, okay, so that might work here, but there might be some other business very different from this coming forward and say, hey, you allow it there, why can't I do it? Is that your fear that you start this slippery slope?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's not allowed. It's not allowed at all in the B3. So we're entertaining the idea of allowing it, and we're good with that. But we're a little bit leery of allowing it. You know, I don't want to say unregulated, but just allowing it. We're allowing this type of method. So from a land use perspective, we would prefer to see it restricted to water-based and food-based and other methods that aren't employing solvents and gases. That's essentially where we're at. If the assembly decided that they wanted to allow CO2 extraction methods, of course we would accept that, but you know, we're pretty much in support of our amendment.
Okay, comments, Chris?
Yeah, you know, I contemplated that quite a bit, and this idea that right around 1/2 block and across the street is a gas station with massive toxic flammable chemicals. And 2 lots down, there is an electroplating company that operated for 30 years with massive chemicals, hydrochloric acid, right in the middle of the neighborhood in this B3 zone. It just, to me, seems like it's if we can do this fair and safely, that it's not a use that is stretching even the boundaries of what's allowed right on that block. And so if in fact that's happening there, then it's probably happening all over town. In fact, there are gas stations that are highly chemical and flammable and toxic environments all over the city. And so it seems to me that it would be fair in allowing this non-flammable use in this area.
I have a question. When I'm looking at it, I think Amendment 5 is fine, but I still also do agree that I'm fine with adding carbon dioxide closed loop extraction systems to the B3. But my question is, just by adding flammable gases, I mean, you're essentially getting your goal of the closed loop CO2 system. But is it a better idea, this is the only time you're going to see me advocate for something longer, is it a better idea to specifically say in there, except a carbon dioxide closed loop extraction system is allowed? I tend to think in this particular amendment, brevity is not necessarily clarity. I think clarity is specifying, okay, we've considered specifically CO2 closed loop systems. We're okay with this one, because I'm thinking in the future, you know, I don't know what other technologies are coming, and I don't know, I'm not a chemist. So as I'm thinking about these things, I think this is what we're really contemplating, is this one specific type. So should we just say that?
I think that would be a simple way to go about it.
Do keep in mind, this is a footnote to a table, the footnotes are getting bigger than the table. Yeah.
I'd like to put the closed loop system in there specifically. Okay?
Yeah, you know, I had the same concern as Amy. You know, Ryan had brought up a point that, you know, by adding flammable, it gets you to where you want to be. But, you know, Ryan, you may not be around to interpret it exactly the same way as other people might. So by specifically adding that language to allow closed loop CO2 system, I think would be my preference.
Clear, like just crystal clear. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's look at another possible added. So not employing solvents, flammable gases, or can we say toxic gases too? Is that relevant?
Toxic and flammable might be separate things.
Right, because I think that your responses to some of the stuff I sent around, you had made the point that the S version would allow
sort of, it's
Is your
Brian,
recording?
Brian Revis. A solvent that may not necessarily be flammable, but is toxic would be acetone, which has been used for cannabis extraction.
Is that covered anywhere in state limits or anything?
I believe so.
It's not the
It's been too
solvent.
long since I've read, but.
I don't have that with me, unfortunately. Look it up.
Mr. Chair, I think I'm gonna also speak, or Amy has spoken, Nick has spoken, that being specific is better than being general in this case. And this specific language of allowing the closed loop carbon dioxide restricts all those other potential uses that some very creative chemist might come up with. You know, I think the intent behind all of this process where the committee and the assembly started being very restrictive, and then witnessing how the process was implemented, and then moving towards less restriction in areas that are proving to be functional, it follows on to take a progressive step and not a giant leap to do one small part instead of opening the gate.
Okay, because I'm sensing a consensus on that. That Amendment 5, saying flammable gases and also adding essentially Amendment 6, I'm fairly comfortable with. So I moved on a bit then and saying,
Okay.
can we also add
Okay.
that you can't have toxic gases or toxic solvents, I guess we want to say.
See, but again, I go back to what the fire marshal said, and I guess I'm kind of leaning on my healthcare industry here. There's a lot of things we have in the office that are toxic, and it was definitely in a business district. But the quantities are so small, typically speaking, that you're using it for, and they're severely regulated by how you can use it, how you can dispose of it, even outside of municipal code. I don't know that that's necessary.
But you're thinking there's already things in code that are covering how we handle toxic chemicals.
I mean, from a healthcare perspective, I know there were. Okay. I was thinking about, I mean, we had some really caustic, things that we used. So I'm not sure that it's really necessary. I mean, in listening to the fire marshal, she was already saying that, well, there are toxic things that are being used that we see out, but there's such small quantities. It's really nothing that is a headliner issue for them.
Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the intent of where we're going with amendment number 5 is when we added the language as described in state regulation, anything that mentions solvents or identifies solvents as, hazardous or toxic, would not be an allowable method of marijuana extraction. So it would be relying on the state to identify those solvents as toxic or flammable in this case, since we're pointing to that regulation. If it were not specifically mentioned in state regulation, again, we kind of be in this gray area. Is it toxic? Is it flammable?
But toxicity is defined though by EPA standards. There's a whole, for almost every chemical I can think of, there's like a whole specific within federal standards, what is hazardous or what is toxic.
Dihydrogen monoxide.
So, again, I think it's kind of, I don't know, I mean, I'm not afraid of saying it, but in real world practicality, there's going to be toxic chemicals that are used in any sort of, well, I don't want to say any sort of, in many operations that transcend medical offices, marijuana manufacturing or extraction facilities. And I don't know that just a broad brush stroke saying you can't have any that are toxic. I think I could probably go pull up a lot of EPA regulations and say, well, that's toxic.
Okay.
Water
And the bottle is this big.
Is some of this covered by the reference to the state code?
Correct.
Okay, so that's a big one.
The language in state regulation that kind of sets the bar for the toxic solvents. It just says, once may be used or when the board approves that exhibit low to minimal potential human health related toxicity. I don't think that's very clear, in my opinion. It doesn't list any specific chemicals or solvents. very bad term, and maybe BPA has some benefit and good research to be done. But it doesn't seem very clear lines and low to minimal potential human toxicity. What's minimal, what's low, what's high. I guess the lines are drawn in these state regulations in this chapter about marijuana statutes, and perhaps some other ones. I don't know them.
So, are you saying that we don't need to, list this in amendment 5? We don't need to mention the state code there?
Well, this says the one in this amendment by non-employing solvents or gases as described. And yeah, we although it doesn't say B3 here, B3 is the one that says solvents-based extractions. It says solvents and gases. The language there lines up with B3, but they don't cite B3 specifically. So I think that still works.
Do you think it still works? Okay.
So, okay. We have short time, but I think we're pretty close, if not there. So essentially what we're driving at is Amendment 5, change it so it says more flammable gases, and also add Amendment 6 wording, if not precisely, get the intent.
I think we can leave flammable out, because I think what we're specifically intending is to open as narrow a pathway forward as possible. And when we add the word flammable, that adds the potential for any non-flammable solvents that aren't carbon dioxide to be used. And so I think really we don't need the word flammable. Instead, we just need
Your sentence.
Amendment 6, right? Because if we add flammable, we actually open the door to all of those other uses.
Oh, I see.
I agree.
understand what you're saying,
So we just need to add Amendment 6 to Amendment 5, whether that's Amendment 7 or we move both, doesn't matter, but I don't think we want to add flammable there because then that opens the door.
I understand, okay. Ryan?
Sure, I agree. And I think the way that we could make Amendment 5 and tack on Amendment 6 without making it substantially longer would just, it would read as marijuana manufacturing facilities producing extracts using water-based, food-based, closed-loop CO2 extraction, or other methods not employing solvents or gases as described in state regulations permitted in B3 district.
Roger that.
That's what I got. I'll second that one.
I third it.
Any opposition? Okay, so will you write this as Amendment 7?
Sure.
Okay.
Make sure we have one member coming forward to our Sunday meeting. I do not, because we got
Can you imagine
4
this
members
is-
here. I don't want 11 members
Actually, we have more than that.
discussing this.
We have 6.
Let's get the one amendment we're gonna go forward with, please.
Okay, on this issue, we do have the amendment for measured in a straight line.
I know, but just on this issue.
Yeah, right.
One amendment.
Can you get rid of 1, 2, 1, 3, 4, and
So
6?
we're amending the S version, which is what we'll go forward with. Ryan?
Correct. Just to point out too, we do have the other amendment about striking out the language of its arrangements of rooms in the definition of 4.2.
I think we settled that at a previous meeting, that we were good with that.
Correct, yeah.
And then also the measured in a straight line, we were good with that. So
Correct.
this is the one we got locked down. All right, Dean?
You have 6 assembly members here. If you make the common recommendation on this amendment number 7, I think that would be helpful. You can stay in the report to Tuesday night. The common recommendation
I would
on this
move
amendment number 7.
Amendment number 7 as recorded.
You know, would we recommend it?
Recommend it.
Recommend approval to the assembly, amendment number 7.
So do we need to have
I think
a
we already
specific
did.
vote on recommending
We
that?
did that, but.
I did too. I thought we didn't.
So Ryan's got an amendment 7, we'll prepare one, and we'll bring that forward, and that'll be the recommendation of the committee. That's
So
what
are we
we're saying.
unanimous, all 6 of us? I think we are, okay.
Our goal.
You know, it's so great that I'm taking a hazardous materials class right now.
This will be
Any thoughts from the?
I know.
Just thank you for your consideration.
Okay. And now you have an operation, you're counting on the CO2. You have that.
We'd like to keep it all under one roof.
But it's the same.
We're in the construction phase still. They're all doing.
I don't know of anybody in this state that's using it. I don't know if anybody's using commercially at all.
Pinnacle is, and it's.
Yeah, that's exactly my response.
So, we have another item here. What time is it? We have plenty of time.
I have to leave in 7 minutes.
Alright. Okay, so we're done with, 2017-175. S, item 4, tentative business, 2018-12. Jeff, can you talk about that, or you wanna wait?
I have time.
Okay.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is, proposed, amendments, 2018-12, and this would be, an ordinance allowing buildings with greenhouses constructed on rooftops to exceed the maximum allowable height of the district by no more than 10 feet in the select district, and amending Yankee Municipal Code section 2114-040 to add the definition of greenhouse. And this came about as an initiative from the Alaska Food Policy Council, and they were looking for ways to increase the amount of agricultural production within the acreage bowl in a way that could utilize existing construction, wouldn't pose any great impacts on neighboring properties, and seeing as only 5% of the food that's consumed in state is actually produced in state, 95% of food is shipped in. Anytime that there is an emergency or an impact to freight lines or shipping lanes, anything like that.
Or the Port of Anchorage.
Or the
In
Port.
Alaska.
Port of Alaska and Anchorage ships into the ocean.
The city of Anchorage could be in a world of hurt.
Whole state would be able to,
Right, correct. This ordinance definitely is not meant to be the end-all, fix-all of that solution or that problem, but it's definitely hoping to get us there.
I love this idea, to be honest with you, which, I know may be shocking, but I do, I love this idea. I think it's narrow enough, the way you drafted it. I think it's, I think the biggest concern we'll get from residents is potential impacts to neighboring properties.
Shadowing.
Right, and so I think your limitation on height is an important one. But I think the way it's been drafted, I think it's kind of like, okay, let's test the waters here and see if this works. But I know in other cities that they do have basically urban gardening, and they have amended their laws and to allow rooftop gardens and stuff. So the concept of it is something that is actually very appealing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At one of our community council meetings, we actually had a presentation from a guy that had some greenhouse drawn in on the top of his building. And the only questions that we got from people, neighbors, was about the height problem. And if you're allowing that on top of a 3- or 4-story building, and that's another 10 feet, that's basically like another story. And so the height restriction was the big sticking point there. So as long as we're keeping it relatively.
Yeah. If you look at page 2, I think items, that little 2I and the 3I are the ones that really help with that concern.
Right.
And that's, I mean, to me, that would be the biggest problem. But I think those two things for the public should help. And also item D. I mean, item D is right there, it says 10 feet, but the structure or any portion thereof shall not penetrate a daylight plane that rises in the road.
So, all right, a couple other points I'd just like to touch on. This is only going to apply in the R3, R3A, R4, R4A, A1B, B3, RO, and I1 zoning districts, which are your multifamily districts, as well as your light industrial districts. I2 is not included because I2 doesn't have a height restriction.
Right.
So there's no exception that can be applied to somebody that doesn't have a height limitation. They will have to get a land use permit. All building permits are land use permits, but not all land use permits are building permits, depending upon if you're in building safety and service area. Anybody outside that would get a land use permit. Anybody inside that would get a building permit. So regardless if you're not exceeding the height limitation or not. If you're making a use provision, you will be required to get a land use permit to construct a rooftop greenhouse. Subsection 2I, that does deal with penetrating the daylight plane. Is a big restriction in that. It's meant to regulate bulk so that you don't have just this massive, huge building right next to R1 neighborhood. It requires, if you are you can't penetrate the daylight plane, so you'd have to set back a rooftop greenhouse, see X amount of feet in order to accomplish that. And then subsection 3I guarantees that any neighboring property would get 6 hours of daylight between March 21st, or between September 21st and March 21st. And then the state go before Planning and Zoning Commission on December 11th, and their resolution of supports the last page.
This looks good, thanks for bringing this forward, it's something we need. I appreciate you defining what greenhouse is, so we're not to fight that out for hours.
Right. So,
Thank you.
And so this is being introduced on Tuesday?
So,
Is there any regulations on what you can actually grow in those greenhouses? Like, is a cultivation place going to try to do this?
For marijuana.
Yeah.
Well, you can't have it combined, if there's residences in the building, you can't.
You can't do it in a residential district.
And it's also can't be visible, and there's like a whole bunch of restrictions that are already in place that would make that visible.
But there was down on Baxter, there was an apartment building that wanted to go in for seniors, they wanted to have a greenhouse at the upper level. They couldn't do that at that time, this would allow them to have that option to put a greenhouse up there.
correct. And during the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, we did discuss, the possibility of saying, well, you can only grow food in these greenhouses, because that's sort of the intent.
Define
is to
food.
increase
Flowers.
Exactly, you run into that issue because what I define as food, you may disagree with, or vice versa. So, and also, in reference to the senior living facility, they usually have programs of growing flowers just for the therapeutic benefit, not necessarily because they find that eating. And we don't want to say, hey, you can't have therapeutic.
Actually, I have a friend that grows some version of pansies, she uses those for her salad.
Yeah.
They are edible. Have a little peppery taste to them.
I don't think we want to get so restricted there. It's just crazy.
Okay, anything else on this? So are we looking for a recommendation? You're just introducing this to us as a.
This was more of just, I wanted a few members of the assembly to have a heads up on this so that when it did come before you at the
Appreciate
actual
that.
assembly meeting, you weren't blindsided, didn't know what it was.
Okay, and I talked to J.R. Wilcox, he said he engineered his building, so if this passes, he can add the green.
Good.
If they choose to.
Well, raising food is always a concern, especially like you said, with our supply line coming up here.
We're the most food-dependent state in the nation.
Well, I think, considering it's already come before the committee, I think it wouldn't hurt to have a recommendation from the committee if you guys are so inclined.